Hello, I'm Ben Tompkins. The city of Los Angeles on the American West Coast has experienced a tragedy that no one was prepared for. Unseasonal wildfires ripping through entire suburbs. Thousands of homes wiped out, and the death toll still left unconfirmed. So, how did we get to this tragedy? Dr. Doug Specht from the University of Westminster joined me to discuss the factors that led to the unfolding of this tragedy and what Australia could do to better prepare for something like this. There are quite a few factors that everyone is saying led to these fires, but in your research, which one do you think is the most prominent?
Yeah, I think we need to separate out the long term, the short term factors here. So, short term, yes, you've got very dry conditions, but also you've got various things that will spark fires. Okay, and so those fires have been sparked by small short term actions, and at the moment there's a lot of finger pointing around what started each individual fire. Now we know full well that forest fires can start for huge numbers of reasons. If you've got dry enough conditions, leaving a glass bottle can start a forest fire as the light diffracts through it and does that. I've seen people blaming rechargeable cars. I've seen people blaming all kinds of things. At this moment, I don't think anyone's actually got any official data on what started the fire in that spark moment. But then we've also got those medium-term factors that say, well, actually, there has been historically less management perhaps of the forested areas in that region than perhaps there might be. So perhaps there's been less clearing of dead wood, less clearing of scrub. These are things that I've seen being talked about, less clearing of fire lanes. And so that makes it much harder to tackle a fire when fire does break out. And then longer term factors, what we're talking about here is that we are seeing drier periods than we've ever seen, but also we're seeing these massively wet periods. And so what we've got is this sort of cycle of real wet periods, much wetter than California would normally be expecting. And that, again, is directly linked to climate change in relation to the amount of moisture that's now being held. About 7% more water vapor is held over the Californian region than used to be. Dropping large amounts of precipitation, warmer weather, plants grow like nobody's business, loads of vegetation, looks very good. A really quick recovery of things, that's great. Of course, then you hit the dry season. And this is traditionally not the dry season in California. This is traditionally the wet season, but we've got this very, very little precipitation this year. All this massive amounts of new vegetation dries out very quickly and then becomes a tinderbox with more fuel than we would normally see, which means the fires are more intense. So what sparked the fire almost doesn't matter. What caused the fire to be so severe was perhaps some levels of mismanagement. That's not necessarily for me to say. I've read various things. The blame game always happens, I think, until the fires are out, until people have had a chance to do full investigations from the official authorities. It's not worth looking or speculating as to whether there could have been better preventative measures in that region. But long term, we know that there was more fuel, more dryness, and that's why the fires were so large. And just sort of as a side note, I remember about 3 or 4 years ago, there was another big fire, and it supposedly started from a gender reveal party, one of these sort of confetti cannons. And this couple, I mean, I'm no fan of setting off a confetti cannon in a very dry forest. It is irresponsible. But this couple took the whole blame for this massive forest fire in the US. But that was actually, people were looking for the tinderbox spark moment because they didn't want to reflect on the fact that this is a climate change incident. And so, blaming the spark, sure, that's what started it. But why were we in a position where something so small could start such a big fire? And I think that's where we need to get the balance. And I think that's one of the important things that journalists need to be doing, which is why it's great to be talking to you, is because actually it's really hard to talk about the 3 years that led to a fire, because the news cycle wants to know about what happened today that led to a fire. And getting that shift in the way that we talk about these kinds of things, I think, is hugely important in educating and informing citizens about what's happening in the world.
In your article from The Conversation, you mentioned something called a hydroclimate whiplash. Can you talk to us a bit about what this entails and what this looks like for something like the LA fires?
Yeah, so simply put, this is really the title that's given to that process I was just speaking of, where you have uh, periods of high intensity wet, and so high intensity growth of plants, followed by periods of high intensity dry. Um, Now this works in both directions. So in California, what we've had is a high intensity wet followed by high intensity dry, which has led to large amounts of highly flammable or easily ignitable vegetation. So large amounts of fuel, big fires. Other parts of the world and at other times of the year, what we might see is long periods of drying, followed by heavy periods of precipitation, heavy periods of rainfall. And there what we get is flash flooding. Because the ground is baked solid, it's like pouring water onto concrete. It doesn't seep in, the water runs off, and you get flash flooding, particularly along dried up river basins and things. And we've seen some pretty devastating floods around the world in the last over the last decade, really, but particularly in the last couple of years, that have been caused by flash flooding of huge amounts of water hitting baked ground. Some of the flooding that was happening in Spain over the summer was caused by this kind of long summer of baking, followed by sudden, unprecedented heavy rainfall that wiped out parts of towns that have been there for hundreds of years. So it works both ways. In California, it's the fires. Other parts of the world will be experiencing the flooding.
How much do you reckon all of this is from a negative human intervention?
I don't think there's really space for debate that this is anything other than human intervention in relation to climate. I think the scientific community has a pretty solid consensus that this is climate change induced by human activity. All the data points to this being post-industrial change. The types of warming, the types of increases in temperature that we see absolutely align with the ways in which humans have been changing the atmosphere on the planet. So it's almost impossible to not make that link. Sure, people will talk to historic fluctuations in temperature. Absolutely. There's never been a fluctuation that looks anything like this. And there really is no debate about whether this is human-induced climate change.
The Australian opposition at the moment is currently talking about moving away from or completely rejecting renewable energy sources. What do you think would be a major consequence of such a big move like this for Australia when the rest of the world is trying to get to net zero?
Yeah, I mean, my understanding is that Australia still has written in legislation that it's aiming for net zero by 2050 or something, isn't it? I think and that's nice to have that target still written in there. I sort of always worry about a target that is quite so many years away, not necessarily because I don't think we've got that long, although many people point to that being too far away to make significant change. But any target that's far away is so many successive governments down the line that you might as well be saying that you're not going to do anything at all. And we know any project, whether you give it a week or 100 years, everyone does the night before. So if we give it till 2050, we'll start looking at that in 2049 and see if we can do it in a year. If we can do it in a year, we might as well do it this year. But I think there has been talk. There's not been. I think last year there weren't any new commitments to wind in Australia, as far as I can tell. Like sort of big scale investment stuff that was already there was carrying on, but new investment wasn't really forthcoming. 40% of energy coming from renewables is commendable, but it's not enough. We know that it's the burning of fossil fuels that is the biggest driver of climate change. Um, we can talk to our citizens and our colleagues and our friends and the population as much as we like about recycling, about driving less, about doing all of these things. But all of this pales into insignificance compared to the huge amounts of pollution that's generated through energy production and also manufacturing of some resources. And so we've got to target those large scale industries and look at where they can be decarbonized if we're going to make a significant shift. And the age old arguments always come out that, well, such and such a country isn't doing this, so why should we? And it's what we sort of call the tragedy of the commons. No one wants to be the one who stands up and says we're doing it well because someone else isn't doing it. It's a shame, I think, that a discussion about whether or not we run the planet into the ground is one that is so politically charged. At the same time, what you've got in Australia is, there's not a full parallel, but you're looking at the closing of the mines in the UK in the 1980s and the big backlash against that. Well, actually, that was environmentally stopping coal mining in the UK was a good thing, right? But at the same time, the thousands of job losses, the miners' strikes, all of these things going on, this hugely political thing. It wasn't a climate-based policy at that time, but we saw lots of job losses. We have communities that still haven't recovered from those job losses. And so you can see why in Australia, where mining, where that kind of industry is still a huge employer, why you can see there's a pushback and why it's politically difficult to say, no, we're not going to be doing these things anymore, because we've seen the effects of that in other countries. Of course, if your community is going to be decimated by a massive wildfire or flash flooding, then unemployment is really the least of your concerns. So on a scale of human needs, having your job that enables you to burn coal, fine. If that causes the flash flood that wipes away your town or wipes away the infrastructure of your country, well, then really it's a moot point as to whether you had that job or not. So we've also got to think about that layers of the human need, the country need, the global need. Politicians, rightly or wrongly, but by the nature of their job, work very much at the individual human need. You need a job, you want security, you want to be happy. Arguing that the country needs this, the country needs that, and the globe needs this is a much harder sell in a political debate. So we end up with these smaller conversations. And again, that's one of the problems around the things like a 20-year strategy, is that doesn't mean much to an electorate. So I can understand why it's become and remains a politically contentious topic in Australia. I think the consequences of not moving away from fossil fuels far outweigh the consequences of some job losses. But I'm also very aware that is a controversial thing to say, and it's not my job that's at risk. So, it's very easy for me to sit here on the other side of the planet and say it's okay for some Australians to lose their jobs for the greater good. That's a easy win for me, but a much more difficult thing to do in reality, and it does have an impact on someone's life tomorrow if we close everything today, but it will have the impact on their life in 10 years if we don't. And that's the trade-off.
If you had to advise on a government policy change, either here in Australia or in the United States, to mitigate or even prevent something like the fires in LA happening again, what area do you think you'd start in first?
Yeah, that's a great question. Some people would argue that we're already a little bit too late to be mitigating, because what we should have been doing is closing down those power stations and moving away to moving towards renewables 20 years ago, and we wouldn't be in this situation. But we are in this situation, and so what we need to be doing is looking at how we again long-term, medium-term, and short-term strategies to mitigate the harms of these things. Short term, need to be looking at things like building regulations, need to be looking at things like land management regulations, land management projects and processes, making sure that forests are well managed. Again, not saying the ones in California weren't well managed. The evidence isn't there yet as to how that played into things. But we do need to ensure that forests are well managed while their landscape changes around them. So making sure there are those fire breaks, making sure that perhaps we're clearing scrub, making sure that we have certain types of biodiversity there. A more biodiverse forest is often more resilient to a forest fire than something that's more close to a monocrop. Then looking at things like building regulations, where are we building new housing? Where are we building things? To what standards are we building those things? Again, there's been discussion about why some buildings have survived and others haven't in California. I think those that have survived, not sure that the things that cause those buildings to not be burnt to the ground are something that can be implemented in every building, but there might be something that can be looked there. What we also then have to remember is that those buildings that have survived are often because an individual has invested a large amount of money, which we're not going to be investing in every single building. So where do we draw a line in what types of preventions happen for what types of buildings, and how does that affect different populations? Do the rich get saved and the poor don't when we're building social housing that's cheaper and we can't afford to put something in? What does that mean? We also need to think about things like floodplains. It's not just the fires. So going that other side of the hydroclimate whiplash, where are we building? Is it on floodplains? Is it flash flood vulnerable zones? So that's quite sort of almost immediate. We can start writing those policies today and start implementing those policies. And I think that's something that we need to be doing. Medium term, we need to be thinking about a sort of a larger level of government capability, but also accountability. So actually giving more, not more power necessarily to the government, but empowering the government to do more around this. So in creating space and finances that enable them to look at climate adaptation policies in a more cohesive way. It's often a sidelined part of government still. Looking at what are the recovery and resilience strategies of regions. What do local government do? Are we funding the fire services appropriately? Are we funding rescue services appropriately? Are these places, huge amounts of the world, half the people doing forest fire prevention is volunteers. This is no longer a volunteer job. This is now a frontline service as we see climate change take grip. And then longer term, it's what do we do about this 1.6 degree warming last year? Well, we need to bring that back down, or certainly not let it go up further. Otherwise, we're seeing the direct effects. We're seeing the change in our climate. And as I said earlier, the climate doesn't care. It will just dump more rain in a different place. The only people that care is us. So we don't need to worry about climate change killing the planet. We need to worry about climate change wiping out our livelihoods, wiping out what we want to do, moving the location of our cities and making some places uninhabitable for us. That's our problem. The climate's going to just rattle on and do what it wants to do anyway. So if we can reverse that a little bit, then maybe we don't need to move entire cities or rebuild everything every couple of years. So yeah, short term, get some regulations in now. Medium term, a bit more commitment from governments to that, an actual strategy. Stop putting volunteers at the front line, start making it a real job. And then longer term, moving away from fossil fuels, moving away from rampant consumption and overproduction of things, and slow down that rate of change.
Yeah, exactly. Well, Doug, thank you so much for joining me today. This has been a very insightful chat.